So section 7.2 of the course, money and inflation. So in this recording, we're looking at the relationship between the money supply and the inflation rate. And we're going to come to an understanding of how increases in the money supply can lead to potentially increases in the inflation rate. So what I've got here is a table from a Reserve Bank publication. So the first thing we need to understand is, well, what is money from an economist's perspective? If you went out onto the street and asked people what is money, people that never studied macroeconomics before, most people would be thinking notes and coins, okay? And certainly that is the definition of currency we can see here, but money is something different. Now, as defined by economists. So we've got different measures of the money supply here. We've got currency, money base, right down to broad money. Now, I'm not interested in you memorizing all of these or any of them. There's no point. And I'm really not interested in you understanding what a private, non-authorized deposit-taking institution is. Sounds pretty boring to me. That's not the point of this course, and that's not where we want to be in terms of an understanding of this stuff. So in terms of the money supply, we're going to acknowledge that the money supply, or our definition of the money supply, is going to be approximately M3. So, and let's not get too hung up on what M3 is. So let's back away from this table altogether, actually. What this table does tell us is that there are different measures of the money supply that the Reserve Bank use, and they would have different purposes for these different measures of the money supply. They might look at the money base to obtain certain information about the economy, and then look at M3 or broad money for other indications of how the economy is performing. But generally, economists will look at how these measures of the money supply, and for broad money, we're probably talking $2.4 trillion there in terms of the overall value of that money supply. In terms of currency, we're probably talking 4%, probably 400, what would it be? It'd be in the billions, wouldn't it? Yeah, so we're talking about currency in the billions. It'd probably be sort of $40 billion, something like that. No, probably 80 billion, but you can check yourself what currency on issue is in Australia. But it'd probably be up around 80, 100 billion would be a guess. Now, I may have that wildly wrong, doesn't really matter. But yeah, so the Reserve Bank does have these different measures of what the money supply is. But when we're going to back away from this table and we're going to say to ourselves, well, the money supply equals currency in circulation plus bank account deposits. Now, you know what currency in circulation is? That's just notes and coins. And we're going to add into our definition of money bank account deposits. So if you say to me, well, what sort of deposits are you talking about? Because there's many different types of deposits in the banking system. My answer would be, I don't care. It's just deposits. So we're treating this at a very conceptual level. I don't want to get bogged down in the detail of all of these definitions. So money, for our purposes, notes and coins in circulation and bank account deposits. Now, we're only interested in, as economists, we're only interested in the supply of money and what the value of the supply of the money stock is and how it changes over time, because the more money you have, the more potential spending power you have. So if I magically doubled the amount of money in your back pocket and I magically doubled the amount of money in your bank account, I've straight away doubled your potential ability to spend. And that would then lead to additional spending, would lead to additional inflation. So money, currency in circulation, bank account deposits. And just keep in mind that money in a bank account deposit is as liquid as currency, I can spend $1,000 in my bank account as quickly as I can spend $1,000 of currency these days. All I do is go to the shop. If I want to spend $1,000 out of my bank account, go to the shop, make that purchase, that $1,000 purchase using my credit card, and then transfer $1,000 from my savings account to my credit card sometime during the interest-free period, ideally. So that money in my bank account using my credit card, it's as liquid as cash, as easy to spend as cash these days. And so that's why we're drawing an equivalence in terms of the amount of money in the economy between currency and bank account deposits. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, what about a term deposit? That money's locked away for 3-6 months, so it can't potentially be spent. If you're thinking along those lines, you're not thinking conceptually enough. My answer to that would be, well, if I really wanted to spend that money in term deposit, I could break it, take the interest rate penalty and spend it very, very quickly. So don't try not to go down those paths where you're thinking about little exceptions to what I'm suggesting here. If you're doing that, you're not thinking at a conceptual, theoretical enough level. Okay, so we know what money is. It's currency in circulation plus all bank account deposits. And that stock of money that exists in the Australian economy at any point in time, that is the currency and bank account deposits, that is potential spending power. That's why we're interested in monitoring how the money supply changes over time. So then what is the relationship between the money supply and the price level? Well, the way I like to think about it is through this equation of exchange. We've got the money supply times the velocity of money equals the price level times the quantity of output produced. Now, I know I've got Q equaling real GDP there. That's technically correct. P is the price level, so P times Q is nominal GDP. But let's just abstract, step back, and think about this equation using the following simple example. Let's imagine we've got a small economy, and the economy produces 25 chocolate bars a year. It's the only thing it produces. And each chocolate bar sells in the marketplace for $2. The total value of output in that economy over that year will be $50. At the same time, there's $10 of money in this economy. Now, of that $10, it might be $2 worth of currency and $8 worth of bank account deposits. It really doesn't matter what the breakup is between currency and bank account deposits of this $10. It really doesn't matter. The key thing is velocity is the value that makes this equation hold. So in this simple example, velocity is 5. So what the velocity of money means is that over the course of the year over which these 25 chocolate bars are produced and $50 worth of GDP is produced, the money supply must be turned over or used 5 times to purchase what is being produced. So what is being produced in the economy is $50 worth of output. We've got a money supply of $10, so that $10 money supply must be used 5 times. So all of a sudden we need to start thinking about the money supply as something which is quite dynamic. The use of it is quite dynamic. And the money supply, I use the term turns over. It is used constantly throughout the year. And so in this example of 10 times 5 equals 2 times 25, this money supply is turned over or used 5 times in the year. Or the money supply is used on average every 2.4 months. So that's the way to think of that. Now, generally what happens is when the money supply increases, so let's just imagine that I increased the amount of money in this economy. For some strange reason, I doubled it to 20. The question then becomes, what would happen? Well, it might be tempting to think if we double the money supply, velocity would halve to 2.5 so that nothing on the right-hand side of the equation changed. tempting to think that, but that's not what the empirical evidence suggests. The empirical evidence suggests otherwise, that the velocity doesn't halve when the money supply doubles. So for simplicity, we're going to assume that the velocity of money roughly stays the same. So then the next, if we double the money supply, something in this equation has got to change, because we're effectively doubling the potential to spend in the economy by doubling the money supply. We're doubling potential purchasing power. Something will have to change. So if it's not the velocity of money, the next possibility is the level of real GDP might double. Well, the problem with that is only if you've got the labour and the capital to produce twice the number of chocolate bars. If that's the case, that's a possibility. But in most bigger, broader economies, if you double the money supply, you can't expect a doubling of national production. Imagine doing that to the Australian economy. Going out tomorrow and increasing the money supply in Australia from, say, a total of $1 trillion. I'm thinking about the M3 measure now. No, sorry, about $2 trillion. Doubling the money supply from 2 trillion to 4 trillion. Do you really think we could then automatically double agricultural production, mining and energy production, services production, health output? Could we magically double the number of hospitals? Could we magically double the amount of capital? Of course not. So if we double the money supply in the Australian economy, we're not going to get a doubling in the level of actual production, that is Q or real GDP. So we've got to look elsewhere. There could be a little bit of scope for Q to increase in this economy. If we go back to the simple economy, maybe there's productive capacity to increase the number of chocolate bars produced from 25 to, say, 30. When the money supply doubles. But still, with a doubling of the money supply, there's going to be so much additional spending on chocolate bars that an increase in production of chocolate bars from 25 to 30 is not going to go anywhere close to absorbing all of this additional spending. So Q can't go up. It's just common sense that I'm using. Unless you are at half your productive capacity, Q can't go up. And even if you thought there was an economy out there which was at half its productive capacity, so that when the money supply doubled, real GDP could actually double as well, then I would just counter with, well, what happens if we increase the money supply by 5 times? Are you then going to go out looking for an economy that is operating at 20% capacity? It's quickly going to get ridiculous. It's just not going to happen. So when the money supply increases, velocity, through assumption and through looking at the data over time, we know that won't halve. So that will stay roughly constant. If anything, it'll increase a little bit, but we won't worry about that. We know Q is not going to be able to double. So what gives in this equation? Obviously, it's the price level. And so if you have a look at time series data of the relationship over long periods of time, decades, of the relationship between the money supply and the price level, the correlation is ridiculous. They almost look like the same line. It's that I've seen graphs for Australia of the correlation between the money supply in levels and the price level and index, and they just follow each other ridiculously closely. So one very powerful way of controlling the price level is controlling the growth rate and the money supply. How do you do that? Using interest rates. We'll get to that later. So the idea then is if the money supply grows faster than the natural growth rate in real GDP, then the additional growth rate in the money supply beyond the growth rate in the level of real GDP will spill over to inflation. Now, you can think of M as being anything between base money and broad money, depending upon the context. In sort of interpreting this equation. In the case of Zimbabwe, the government and the central bank were printing and circulating new notes, new new currency. So in that case, it was actually base money that was growing very, very rapidly. And so it would make most sense in Zimbabwe's case to interpret the money supply here, M, as sort of almost currency, base money. Going back to here, we can see that currency and base money, very similar quantities. Currency is 4% of nominal GDP in Australia. Excuse me, base money is 6%. So they're almost, they're very similar measures. How do I know that? Because one's 4% of GDP, the other 6%. Those numbers are very close. The difference is only 2% of GDP. So they are quite similar numbers. So yeah, in the case of Zimbabwe, because they were printing money, they were circulating new currency. And so to get the most, to sort of measure the relationship between the money supply and the price level for Zimbabwe, I would be tempted to sort of use a definition of base money in terms of M, and then have a look at the correlation of base money with the price level. What I've got down here is a $100 trillion note. I've actually got one of these notes. A student gave it to me about 10 years ago. Excuse me. Yeah, so just incredible the sort of inflation that was created. The only way you can create the type of inflation that occurred in Zimbabwe is through massive growth in the money supply, which then increases the price level through the mechanism I just described. More money, more purchasing power. If you have more money chasing the same number of goods, the outlet will be the price level. The price level will just go through the roof. When that happens, you need to make, over time, you need banknotes which have an increasing number of zeros on them. Whereas if I was using this equation for Australia, I would be more inclined to think of M as broad money and model the relationship between broad money and the price level. When I say model, I'm talking about calculating the correlation between those two variables over time. So for Australia, broad money and the price level. One would be measured in dollars and cents, broad money. The price level would be an index number, but I could simply calculate the correlation between those two variables over time. And so now you understand the reason for the high degree of correlation between the money supply and the price level. When the money supply goes up, Q can't magically go up. History tells us that velocity will fluctuate over time, and it's a little bit inaccurate to call, to suggest that velocity is stable, but certainly velocity won't fall when the money supply increases. It'll either be stable or actually increase as well. And so therefore the only outlet, the only way the pressure of an increase in the money supply can be released is through higher prices. Now, of course, when you increase the money supply, you'll only get higher prices if that money is spent. Now, in the case of Zimbabwe, that wasn't a problem. So what happens during these sorts of periods of hyperinflation? Well, the government, for whatever reason, starts increasing, along with the central bank, starts increasing the money supply. And that increase in the money supply may start off as being quite moderate. That fuels a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, just more spending on consumer goods, perhaps some investment goods. And as the aggregate demand curve begins to increase to the right, the price level starts to rise. And as the price level starts to rise, and therefore the inflation rate starts to move up, the problem now faced by the government and the central bank is if they print the same amount of new money that they did before, it wouldn't have the same purchasing power as it had before because the price level is now higher. So if the government printed $50 billion worth of new notes and coins in Zimbabwe first time round, to stay ahead of the inflation, to stay ahead of the higher price levels, they might have to print $100 billion next time. And then what happens when the third printing of money comes around? Well, if they print 100 billion again, because the price level would have increased much higher, that would enable them to purchase less than before. So they might have to print 200 billion next time, and 500 billion the next time, and 1 trillion the next time. And so in a lot of these cases, what we've seen, Zimbabwe, Yugoslavia, Turkey, Germany, during the period between the First and Second World Wars for Germany, is the government not only printed and circulated money, and they circulate the money by spending it, by injecting into the economy, but the rate at which they increase the money supply increases exponentially. So the growth rate in the money supply starts off at a moderate rate and then just increases exponentially. The growth rate in the money supply increases exponentially. Okay, so that is the relationship between the money supply and the price level. Now, what we'll be talking about very, very soon is how the central bank can increase the money supply. So what we've got to figure out is how all of this is tied into monetary policy, how it's tied into QE, et cetera, et cetera. You may have seen this equation of exchange before, and you may have an appreciation that the money supply, the increases in the money supply, do actually lead to increases in inflation. But if I then, even if you've seen this equation of exchange before, if I then asked you, how is this equation of exchange tied into QE? How is it tied into more traditional monetary policy in Australia? You may then struggle to make the connections. And that's what we'll be doing in this topic. We won't just be treating the equation of exchange as this standalone theoretical concept. We'll actually be tying it back to monetary policy in Australia. And I'll be showing you, possibly for the first time, how this equation of exchange actually works and how economists, like the economists at the central bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia, how they actually think about this equation of exchange.